It's marvelous to listen to this young Handel. The second link on the page recalls Psalm 3. Remember, the poet says, "You are the one who lifts up my head." It is almost an anticipation of the De Torrente, the last movement of the Handel before the Gloria, which is at the link on the screen if you choose to find that link in YouTube. But that psalm is extremely important, Psalm 110, and is used extensively in the New Testament. And within the Psalter itself is celebrated. And look at the skill of this celebration in the following acrostic. At home, abroad most willingly I will bestow on God my praises' utmost skill, chanting his works, works of unmatched might, deemed so by them who in their search delight. Endless the honor to his power pertains, from end as far his justice eke remains. Gracious and good and working wonders so, his wonders never can forgotten go. In hungry waste he fed his faithful crew, keeping his league and still in promise true. Lastly his strength he caused them understand, making them lords of all the heathen's land. Now what could more each promise, doom, decree, of him confirm, sure, just, unmoved to be? Preserved his folk, his league eternal framed, quake then with fear when holy he is named. Reverence of him is perfect wisdom's well. Stand in his law, so understand you well. The praise of him, though wicked hearts repine, unbounded bides, no time can it define. Well, we're nearly halfway through, and today we're going to look at the construction of the Psalter as a whole. This is an extract from an earlier presentation that I gave at the Open University in London in June, and I hope it works well for you. Next week we'll move on to the more personal part of our journey, but through all the weeks, remember what we have learned in the first session: the importance of repeated words, parallelism, and organizing the text so that we can see these poetic techniques to give us a sense of what the poet considered the most important components. Usually these are things that are surrounded by the repeated words. Now briefly, let's look at larger structures in the Psalter. We have already hinted that these are observable. On the surface, we have 150 poems in 5 books. Each book is marked with a short closing doxology. The example is given from Psalm 41:14, the last verse of Book 1. The books are also arranged in a sandwich structure. We'll see that on the next slide, in the next 2 slides. There's also an overall structure that is curiously managed by the acrostics. Here's the surface structure, and I'm grateful to Anthony Macaulay Associates for the diagramming surface that is a part of GX Leaf. This is a ridiculously complex view of the Psalter. I did dozens of others until I began to see the whole using the acrostics. The sandwich structure. Books 2 and most of Book 3, to Psalm 86, are called the Eloist Psalter. The software that I'm using also supports queries, dashboards, and other drill down and presentation tools in its interactive development environment. This particular graph was written to ask, how are the divine name and the words for God used in the Psalter? The result is a remarkable sandwich. The Lord, or Adonai, Hashem, Yod-He-Vav-He, as bread, and Elohim as the meat in Psalms 42 to 86. If we look at the overall structure of the Psalter, from the point of view of the way the poems are organized as indicated by the inscriptions in the Hebrew, we find a whole series of envelopes. We already mentioned the opening and closing envelope of Psalm 1 and 2 with Psalm 149. And when we begin to look at Book 1, it is almost entirely of David, excepting Psalms 1 and 2, and excepting Psalm 33, one of the pillars that we'll talk about later. Notice how Book 1 begins with David and Book 5 ends with David. So we've got another overall envelope to the Psalter in the books, in the Psalms of David. Notice also that David is the only one to whom at least one psalm is attributed in each book. Books 2 and 3 have a series of attributions. It opens with Psalms of Korah, then at Psalm 50 there's one Psalm of Asaph, then there's Psalms of David, and Psalms of David surround 3 harvest psalms which have no attribution. Then we come back to the Psalm of Asaph, and then a number of additional psalms of the children of Korah. Interesting that we have this Korah, Asaph, David, David, Asaph, Korah. Then we come to Book 4, organized around the name of Moses, and also containing 2 very similar prayers that have an internal organization to themselves around the word renewal. Books 1 and Book 5 are both organized around 4 acrostics each. Book 5 also contains a series of poems called the Songs of Ascent, and then we're back to the Psalms of David. So it's a very tight organization when you come to look at the inscriptions and see them organized in this way. Now let's look at these acrostics, these 8 acrostics. They occur only in books 1 and 5, 4 in each. All the acrostics in book 1 are defective. These are Psalms 9 and 10 together, then Psalm 25, 34, and 37. All the acrostics in Book 5 are perfect. There are no letters missing. These are Psalms 111 and 112, then 119, 22 8-verse poems in that psalm, and 145, the last psalm before the final praises. If we look at the poems just prior to each acrostic, it appears that each acrostic follows and celebrates a psalm of significance. So in this we highlight Psalm 8, 24, 33, and 36 in Book 1, and in Book 5, Psalm 110, 118, and 144, 7 psalms altogether. There is a chiasm connecting the first and last psalms in this set. Psalm 8 contains the phrase, "What is a mortal?" and the word fingers, ma enosh. Psalm 36 is an oracle, na'un. Psalm 110 is an oracle, na'un. And Psalm 144 mimics Psalm 8. What is this humanity? Ma adam. And it includes the only other mention of fingers in the Psalter. This diagram shows the relationship between these poems. That there are 4 acrostics in each of Books 1 and Book 5, and that one of them is quite special, being an 8-fold acrostic, and that there are 4 acrostics in the book of the Lamentations of Jeremiah, and that chapter 3 in that book is quite special, being a 3-fold acrostic. This suggests that these poems in the Psalter reveal a very high-level organization centered around the exile. The Psalms tell the full canonical story of Israel and Judah. The Psalter may be thought of as a tent, which one inhabits as one might inhabit poetry, metaphorically, of course. A tent doesn't need one gate, though Psalms 1 and 2 do provide the main gate. One can always slip under the canvas, or perhaps it is open all round. But a tent does require some tent poles and a few high wires. There are such poles, 2 sets in fact, that we've mentioned before already. The 8 acrostics, 9 poems, as one got ripped in half, and the poems that immediately precede the acrostics, 7 of them. And secondly, the duplicated poems, which you can see in the image, 14 equivalent to 53, 57 and 60 together being equivalent to 108, and the last few verses of Psalm 40 being repeated in Psalm 70. The 16, the 7 poems that precede the acrostics, and the 9 acrostics, those 16 that hold up the whole tent are in Books 1 and 5. The 7 others create a space between Books 1, 2, and 5 for Books 3 and 4. These shorter books just have the canvas draping over them without the need for being held up. And the pair of high wires from 8 to 144 and from 36 to 110, which we mentioned in the previous slide, help hold the tent canvas up as well. These are thick cables. There are, of course, other relationships between Psalms which we've discussed during the course. Perhaps the weight of those thick cables rests on the duplicated Psalms. Notice also that none of these poems that I've mentioned is attributed to Korah or Asaph or anyone else except of David. And then there are a few that have no attribution. Well, here we are at our exercise with 2 remarkable poems, Psalms 111 and 112, identical in shape and form, that celebrate Psalm 110. Notice how many significant key words are shared by both Psalms, and how the character of the Lord and the character of the person who fears the Lord are similar and have a similar impact. So you can ask, what do these poems tell us about, shall we say, the possibility of incarnation? Now, on the homework front, there's a danger when you concentrate on structure that you will miss content. And the content of books 2 and 3 is a substantial reflection on the experience of the exile and is filled with personal and corporate lament. This homework will give you plenty to think about. Enjoy the reading.